evening, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls. Welcome back to another edition of Stig of the Dump. This is chapter 8. Excuse me while I just put my glasses back on. That's better. Because without them, I can't read a thing. Stig of the Dump. This is chapter 8, and it's called Midsummer's Night. Barney lay awake on his bed. It was hot, and he hung his feet over the edge of the bed to cool them down. Somewhere in the room, a summer mosquito was whining about, and from outside came the drone of a farm tractor working late, and the barking of dogs from the village. Though the curtains were drawn, he knew it was still daytime outside. It would be daytime for hours yet. He had to go to bed in the daylight just because he was only 8. Still, he wouldn't go to sleep. He couldn't. It was so hot and stuffy. He had asked his grandmother why he couldn't stay up until it was dark, and she explained that today was the longest day and tonight was the shortest night, and that it wouldn't get dark until after 10 o'clock, far too late for a boy of 8 to stay up. All right, he thought. If it's the shortest night, he wouldn't go to sleep at all. He would see what it was like not to sleep. Barney thought of Stig. I bet he doesn't go to sleep when it's daylight, he thought. And he's how old? How old was Stig? About 8? 80? 800? 8,000? Thinking of figures made Barney feel drowsy, and before he knew it, he'd gone to sleep. It was grandmother going to bed that woke him up again. She only opened the bedroom door a little to see if he was all right, but suddenly he was wide awake. Bother! He'd been asleep after all, but he wouldn't do it again. He'd stay awake now. He got out of bed and looked out of the window. At first, he thought it was still daytime, but no, the light came from a big white moon in the south, and in the north there was still a bluish light, as if the sun had not gone far out of sight behind the elm trees. He wouldn't go back to bed. He'd go out in the moonlight. He'd go and see Stig. His heart was thumping as he thought of the idea. It was still very warm, so he slipped on a pair of shorts and nothing else, and crept carefully out of the bedroom and down the creaking stairs. He pulled at the stiff bolts at the front door, trying not to make a noise, but Dina, the spaniel, who slept downstairs, must have heard him, for she gave a questioning bark. "Be quiet, Dina," Barney whispered crossly. "It's only me, and if you don't shut up, you'll spoil everything." At last he managed to undo the stiff bolts and the lock, and the door swung open. He went out into the shadow of the house, and then into the moonlight. Everything was very still. Suddenly he jumped as he heard his name called. "Barney!" It was Lou, looking down from her bedroom window. "Barney, what are you doing?" Lou hissed. "Just going out. Nothing to do with you," answered Barney quietly. "But it's the middle of the night." "I know, I don't care. It's light as day." "Golly, so it is," said Lou. "But where are you going, Barney?" "I'm not going to tell you." "Oh, please, Barney, don't go yet. Can't I come too?" Lou begged. Barney looked at the dark shadows under the fruit trees and thought of how shadowy the pit could be. Perhaps it would be better with two. "All right, you can be my bodyguard. Hurry up then." "Oh, thank you, Barney." Lou's head disappeared from the window, and soon Barney heard the click of her door and the creak of the stairs. When she appeared at the front door of the house, she had Dina with her. "I thought I'd bring Dina too," she said, "as an extra bodyguard. Where are we going, Barney?" "I'm going to see Stig." Lou gasped. "Really and truly, Barney?" "Of course. You can come with me to the pit, but I'll have to ask him if he wants to see you." "All right, Barney," said Lou, with wide-opened eyes. They set off together through the moonlit garden. "The red roses look black in the moonlight," said Lou. "Do they?" said Barney. "I can see as well in the moonlight as I can in the daytime. Come on." They went through the gate into the paddock. Flash, the old pony, was awake and cropping the dewy grass. He tossed his head up and snorted in surprise when he saw them, then went back to his feeding. They crossed the paddock, Dina running in rings along rabbit trails, and came to the edge of the copse. In spite of the strong moonlight and the faint glow in the north, it looked very dark under the trees. They stood still. "Shh, shh, shh," said Barney. "What is it?" whispered Lou. "Isn't it quiet?" whispered Barney. It was so quiet that they could hear the chiming of the church clock from a long way away. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. "Midnight," breathed Lou. They walked to the edge of the dark wood together, then they stopped. How different the moonlight made everything look. They seemed to be standing on the edge of a forest, pierced by shadowy glades. Instead of the straggling copse they knew, even Dina, who usually took any excuse to go plunging into the thickets after rabbits, seemed to hesitate. Then she sniffed. The hair on the back of her neck rose up, and she barked. Suddenly, Barney felt the hair on his neck rising up too. He jumped as the pony came prancing up and snorted behind him, and stood looking with pricked ears in the same direction as Dina. Dina barked again. Then before their eyes, a great animal leapt into the patch of moonlight in the glade and stood there for a moment. "It's a stag," breathed Lou with astonishment. "I know," whispered Barney. "But there aren't any stags here," exclaimed Lou. Dina was the first to recover from the shock, and she hurled herself into the glade, and the stag bounded off into the wood with Dina in pursuit. The pony snorted and blew behind them and stood there with quivering nostrils. It was then that the children went midsummer crazy. Without a word, Lou grabbed the pony by the mane. Barney legged her up onto the pony's back. Lou hoisted him up in front, and before they could stop to think, they had cleared the fence and were galloping straight for the edge of the pit. The pit was there all right, the pony poised on the edge. Then with a spring and a scramble, which kept them too busy clinging with legs and hands to think what was happening, Flash was down and up the other side. What had happened? Instead of the great quarry there was a mere scratch in the ground. And now nothing was familiar. They expected every minute to come to the cornfield beyond the copse, but the thickets and glades stretched on and on. They were treading the slope which should have led to the lane, and Flash slowed down a little, but from far ahead came Dina's mad yelping and the crashing of undergrowth, and the pony needed no urging to pursue the hunt. And still no landmarks came in sight. No fields, no hedges, no orchards, no farms, only hazel thickets, beech woods, and the chalky hillside. Without a rein to guide or restrain him, the pony went like the wind, his head well up, and Barney and Lou could only cling there with their bare hands and legs and look with round eyes at the strange landscape. "Barney," gasped Lou, clinging to her brother ever more tightly than she'd ever done before. "We're dreaming all this, really?" "You might be, I'm not," Barney shouted against the wind, and twinned his fingers more tightly into the pony's mane. They were galloping up a little valley between clumps of bramble and taller trees. There was no sound of barking from Dina. Suddenly, there in the moonlight was the dog, lying stretched out on the turf right in front of them. The pony slowed and swerved. The children fell off in a tangle of limbs on the soft turf that smelt of wild thyme, and the pony trotted off casually to get its breath back. Of the stag, there was no sign. Barney and Lou sorted themselves out. Lou tried to stand up, but her legs felt woolly after using them to cling on for such a long time, so she sat down again. "Well, Dina," she said to the dog, "where's the stag, eh? Couldn't catch it, I suppose. Never mind, you're not a staghound, are you, hey, Dina?" Then she turned to Barney. "Barney, if we're not dreaming all this, where are we?" "Don't know," replied Barney. "Let's go on just a little bit more and maybe we'll see." There was a line of beech trees at the top of the little valley, and Barney felt there must be something on the other side of them. He scrambled up the slope, went between the dark trunks, and beyond them was nothing. It was like flying. Smooth turf sloped down steeply under his feet, and far below the land was spread out like a map. "Lou," he called, "look where we are." They realised they were standing on the edge of the North Downs, a place they knew well enough, and the moon made everything look as clear as day. And yet the more they looked, the stranger it was. There should have been pylons striding over the land carrying electric cables. There should have been squares of orchards, hop gardens, villages and churches. There should have been cement works in the distance by the river. And where was the tall television mast with the red light on top? They could see nothing but forest and heath over the whole floor of the valley, and out of the night strange animal noises came up to them. And in this stretch of empty land there were only three points of light twinkling to show that man was somewhere about. The nearest light was only a little way along the side of the hills, and now they could hear human voices coming from it. "It's a campfire," said Barney. "Come on, let's go and see." "But it might be savages or something," said Lou doubtfully. "There aren't any savages in England." "There aren't any stags in this part of England, but we just saw one, and that doesn't seem to be England at all." "Well, it must be somewhere," said Barney. "Let's go and ask these people." "I think we ought to be careful," said Lou. "Let's just creep up through the woods and have a look." They went back into the shadow of the beech woods and made their way as quietly as they could over last year's crackling leaves and husks. "Keep to heel, Dina," whispered Lou. "Barney, I wish we had a lead. Dina might give us away." I think I've got some string in my pocket," said Barney. He rummaged in his pockets and pulled out a coil of hairy string that he had taken from a run of beans that seemed to have finished with it. They tied it to Dina's collar and went cautiously on. Soon the sounds of the camp were quite near, and they could see the red firelight flickering through the black beech trunks. "Sounds as if they're having a party," said Lou. "Listen, music." "That's not music," said Barney. "Well, it's jazz or something, or one of those skiffle groups." As they moved towards the firelight, keeping to the shadows, the noises were so loud that they did not have to worry about keeping quiet themselves. They reached the last beech tree of the wood, a giant with thick roots coiling into the chalky soil and broad boughs spreading out towards the slope on which the camp stood. "What are you doing, Barney?" hissed Lou, as Barney started scrambling onto one of the spreading branches. "I'm going to climb this tree so I can see." "So am I then." "What about Dina? You can't bring her up." "I'll tie her up here," said Lou. "Lie down, Dina. Be quiet. That's a good dog." They climbed from limb to limb of the great beech tree until they got to a thick bough that grew straight towards the firelight. Barney sat astride it and inched himself along until he reached a fork far out over the bushes and brambles that straggled along the edge of the wood. They had a perfect view of the camp. Or was it a camp? There were beehive huts made of poles planted in the ground, tied together at the top and thatched with straw and rushes. In an open space there was quite a crowd of people gathered around the fire. None of them seemed to be wearing much more than Lou and Barney. All of them seemed to have a lot of wild black hair, except a few grey and white beards. The older ones were sitting, lying or squatting around. Toddlers were tumbling or sleeping over the dust, and boys and girls were chasing each other around the outside of the crowd or teasing fierce-looking dogs. The noise that was something like music came mostly from a group in the middle of the crowd near the fire. There were 4 figures in the group. One was holding half a jawbone of a large animal and running another longer bone up and down the teeth, making a scratchy rhythm. Another had a hollow log which he was hitting with 2 wooden clubs. The third was the singer. He didn't seem to have much idea of a tune, and the children couldn't understand the words, but it was quite clear what the song was about. One moment the singer was a deer, grazing peacefully, and then looking anxiously about. Then he was a hunter, stalking his prey with spear poised. Then he was the deer fleeing, the hunter throwing his spear and the deer falling, the hunter carrying it back to camp. The crowd became as excited as the singer and joined in with claps of hands and cries. But yet there was another sound, which the listeners could not quite understand, a kind of bloom, blung, blong, bloom. Not always on one note, as most of the singing was, and not really taking much notice of the rhythm of the long drum and jawbone. It was as if someone who had never heard a tune was trying to play It was as if someone who had never heard a tune was trying to play one for the first time, with a tea chest, a string, and a broomstick. Then the bone scraper, in his excitement, joined the singer in a little shuffle dance, and the children could see the fourth member of the band. On the ground was a large hollow animal skull with great horns. Tied between the horns were 3 or 4 lengths of string or gut, and the small figure was squatting by this simple harp, plucking at the strings, blung, 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 and taking very little notice of anyone else. In fact, the song came to an end. The drummer gave the final thump on his log. The bone scraper rattled to a stop, and the little harpist went on with his 3 notes as if he were the only musician in the world. Some of the crowd began to laugh and jeer at him as he played away, but it wasn't until someone threw a meat bone, catching him on the head with a clunk the children could hear in the tree, that the player looked up as if surprised that he was not alone. Barney nearly fell off his branch. "It's Stig!" he almost shouted. "Shush, Barney," Lou hissed. "You'll give us away." "But it is Stig," said Barney excitedly. "I said he was clever. He probably invented that thing he was playing music on. Where's he going now?" For the little figure Barney said was Stig was rather sulkily walking away from the campfire towards the trees. "He's coming this way," whispered Lou. "Barney, you're not to give us away." "Why not? He's my friend." "What about all the others? Who are they?" "You never said about them." "I don't know who they are. I never saw them before." "Well, we'd better be careful, Barney." "Oh, all right." But what gave them away was Dina, tied up at the bottom of the tree. She'd been quiet up till now, but when she heard Stig walking towards the wood, she began to growl, and then gave a short, sharp bark. On the edge of the bushes, Stig at once froze into stillness. Dina went on barking, and some of the wild children playing on the outside of the crowd heard her too. The bolder ones ran to the edge of the wood. The little ones ran to their parents by the fire. Soon a number of armed elders, snatching up spears and clubs, were making for the wood, and the sound of Dina's bark. Lou and Barney clung at the high branch like squirrels, not daring to move. They could see the strange people at the edge of the wood, wondering at the unusual sound of a spaniel's bark. Then at last plucking up courage to advance into the darkness of the bushes and the beech forest, holding their weapons at the ready. Dina's barking became more and more frantic as she heard the rustling of bodies through the bushes all around, and the crackling and snapping of footsteps. Under cover of the noise, Barney whispered, "Lou, we've got to escape." "How can we?" breathed Lou. "Look where that bough goes." Barney pointed in the moonlight. The limb they were on stuck out into nothingness, but one of its branches went across to another long limb, and this one stretched out and rubbed shoulders with another great beech tree. If they climbed over there into the other tree, Barney thought, they could escape. "We can go across there," he whispered. "Come on, while they're making all this noise." Lou's face seemed to go quite pale. "Oh, Barney, we can't, and they'll find Dina anyhow." "I'm going to try, and then perhaps we can rescue Dina." He inched himself backwards along the limb they were sitting on until he reached the branch that grew crosswise. When he came to it, he wondered what to do. It was too thin to sit astride, so he decided to hang on underneath it like a sloth, with his hands and his legs. Upside down, like this, he crawled through the empty air between the 2 big limbs. By bending his head right back, he had an upside-down view of the floor of the forest, patched with moonlight, and right beneath him was a wild hunter with the tip of his spear pointing skywards, but looking at the ground. Barney hung without moving until the man had passed on, then moved as quickly and as quietly as he could to where the branch passed over the other great limb. Here he got himself right way up on the bough again. His heart was thumping and his legs felt quivery, but at least he was safer for a little while. But now he had to go outward to where the 2 trees shook hands high in the air. He worked his way forward. As he went, the boughs became thinner and swayed more. At last he was at where the trees met. Where the branches crossed, their movement in the wind had rubbed a great dry scar, and nothing he could do could stop a loud creak coming from the rubbing place every time he moved. I must get over onto the other tree, he thought. As quickly as he dared, he turned round so as to go backwards down the new branch, let go the branch he had just come up, and crack! It was a dead branch. Barney fell through nothing, then struck a flat leafy branch below, slid outwards from this onto the lower one, crashed through and fell the last few feet onto the soft forest floor. Oh. That's the end of the chapter. That's not so much of a cliffhanger, that's a tree hanger. And tomorrow night, we've got the last chapter. It's called Chapter 9, The Standing Stones. And now, I do believe it's time for me to go to bed. I hope you're enjoying the story. Good night.